Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about building a web app for everyone, but with React. So more importantly, we forget about the aspect of accessibility in general, and I'll be covering that today. A bit about my introduction. I work as a front-end engineer at Vanguard. I'm a Google developer expert in web and also an organizer at React India. So, and if you want to find me on Twitter, you can definitely go to Manjula_Dubey, and that's where I tweet about React and accessibility mostly. So a bit about my company. Vanguard is the only large asset management company that is wholly owned by its investors and has no owners and shareholders. So this client-owned structure basically helps us to focus on the best outcomes for our clients. So one thing that we really make sure at Vanguard is, is this good for our client? We are now growing also in Europe and Australia and Asia. Although we are like a financial company, our focus is more on the technology side. Also, we value a lot accessibility. That means a very good example of that is we are around 7,000 people in tech. So that gives you already the whole number. So we've 19 global offices. We're about 17.6 crew worldwide. And yes, if you're looking for a job, definitely visit our website. We are currently hiring from both technology and management side. And when I talk about accessibility, what we value at Vanguard is all users have equal access to information and functionality regardless of their ability, which we strictly follow at Vanguard. We also make sure that we work to ensure that all our investors can access our products and services to help them reach their financial goals. So today, what I'll be covering is what is accessibility. I'll be going through some common practices. Basically, how would you handle forms in general when you're dealing with React? Also, a bit about error handling and using images and icons. How would you use it? Animations, or something about area attributes, and how would you test that if your website or web app is accessible or not. Firstly, I would like to start with this saying that accessibility is not a barrier to innovation. In fact, it brings us an innovation because you're kind of building and including everyone, and everyone all around the world is kind of using your product. So it's not a barrier. In fact, it's an innovation. And when I talk about working with React, it's not a rocket science, because under the hood you're still writing HTML, even though you term it as JSX, but you're still writing HTML. Why should you really care about accessibility is the first question, right? We all think. In this world, I say, it's not only your friends or you using your, web or internet. It's your grandparents, it's public authorities, sometime monitoring your website. It could be people with, diverse background. For example, they might be people with visual or, auditory, motor or cognitive disabilities. And, you have to serve all of them. You have to make things possible and build for everyone. So if I have to give a stats, this is how the stats looks like. 1 in every 10 users will have some kind of disability. And this might also be a situational. So, it is just not somebody who has been disabled right from birth. It can also be a situational, because you might just break your arm. So yes, accessibility even covers that part. And if you don't follow it, you're inviting somebody to just sue you. For example, you already know a story in US, for example, a man who was disabled, who could not use Domino's website. he had filed a case in the court, and he actually won, which means legal and authorities are always monitoring you. If you're not working towards it, start today. And to give you a bit of a report, so Web Accessibility in Mind 2020 did a very, random research, and they took like top few websites, and they monitored, and they really did the audit, and they found that 98.1% of all the top websites homepages have WCAG failures, which is a quite a big number. And most of the websites, top websites, so to say, failed all of the minor issues. For example, no contrast, empty links, empty buttons, missing alternate text for your images. So these were the things that, that basically this company found out. And it was an amazing report, actually. But to be honest, when you think of accessibility, it really does it really is not a very good report. So a bit about WCAG. It is a set of guidelines and techniques published by the working group at Web Accessibility Initiative of World Wide Web Consortium, which is also called W3C. And currently WCAG 2.1 is what we have. There is in future, there's WCAG 3.0, which is also known as a Silver Project, which is still a draft catering to improve the accessibility of the products on the variety of platforms, including disability needs. Also, when the draft will be released, it will cover emerging technologies such as how would you make accessible, in the areas of WebXR, augmented reality, and voice input. And if I talk about, compliance levels, so under this WCAG guidelines, there are different compliance levels, which means A, AA, AAA. Each level includes guidelines that must be met in order to consider that your website is accessible or not. And these levels are built on 3 principles, which means here it says you must do all of the things that falls under compliance level A. This means you should be doing it, and this is like you could have done that in order to achieve the conformance level AAA. So if your website wants to be accessibly compliant, at least you should be level A compliant. A bit about the history of how we got all of these into picture. So there's already ADA, which is like Americans with Disability Act, passed in 1990, which is like a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against any individual, and it could be related to information technology, and they make sure that all of these informations are accessible by all the people using it. And same goes with Section 508. It is a part of Rehabilitation Act and ensures that all the federal agency information is accessible to everyone. Doesn't matter. It includes basically everything, from electronics to your IT and everything. And European Accessibility Act is in Europe, which means it caters to see that your website is basically accessible or not. So when I started off, thinking about accessibility, I totally had a very different perception. I just thought that it's about blind people and that's it. But that was not the case. I mean, it's far beyond that. So if we see about the principles, it means that everything that we build follow these core principles, which means it should be perceivable, it should be operable, it should be understandable, and it should be robust. Which means any content that you put on the website should be perceived by everyone, should be operatable, even on keyboards, any device that you use, and should be understandable by everyone. Which means building for everyone, right? No matter what framework we use, doesn't really matter. it should be accessible. Actually, the React docs, when you open it, the first line itself says that React fully supports building accessible websites, often by using standard HTML techniques. So it's not that if you're using some kind of framework or library, it prohibits you shipping accessible products. In fact, because under the hood you're still writing HTML, so nothing can prevent us. There are many ways to browse web, and if you say so, accessibility is already built in browsers, which means web is already accessible to you, although it's your job now to make it more accessible, right? And all of us started as a front-end developer learning HTML. I mean, it's not rocket science, it's just writing it more semantically correct. So write semantic HTML from the start. Start following it right from your start while you're building it. And a very nice thing that you already have to do it is, you could just go to w3.org and you will find all the techniques and all the compliance levels that that you could see in your website and apply to those to improve it. So it's not rocket science. Some general tips, I often start with, if you could provide a keyboard shortcut, it really helps not only the users who are disabled, or it might just help out normal users also to save their time. So it's always a good idea to have keyboard shortcuts. I also start with color contrast because, before we move on to some math, we need to know that what contrast ratio, are what it is basically. So if you see here on the left-hand side, it says good contrast ratio, and on the right-hand side, basically it says bad contrast ratio, which means the DevTools actually gives us a way to check that if it is following AA compliance or not. If you see on the left-hand side, you have like a AA compliance, which is says green tick, but on the right-hand side, it says, you need to, it doesn't comply really because the contrast ratio is 1.87. You need to work more on it to make the contrast ratio better. So to achieve an ideal AA conformance level, the contrast ratio for most of the body text should be 4.5:1. And for any larger text, it should be 3:1, which means now you see this is an example which I added to my slide. When you add the first color, it says, no, it's not compliant. Now when you add it, it says yes, you were AA compliant for the large text, which means it is above 3, which is okay. So you always have these tools to check. So even though your designer is giving some brand colors, as a developer, you could also just go and check whether whether your brand colors or primary or secondary colors are accessible enough. So the website which I used before was contrastratio.com. So definitely check it out. I also say, start with using battle tested libraries already, because, it doesn't make sense to reinvent the wheel. And already if you're working with React, a lot of things already are there in the community because they are building it. So why not use them? For example, if I talk about date picker or if I talk about modals, so just go and use them. One thing I also say that, do not style the text to give it a visual appearance of headings, which, often, you might be doing it, but yes, stop doing that. Here in the code, if you see, I've applied like a p tag and given a font weight and font size to make it look like heading, which is really not the heading, because when you start with headings on your page and the screen readers are navigating through your page, headings are basically a way for them to understand, okay, what's there on the page which is more important, what's like the heading level 2, what's like the heading level 3. So for them, for the users who are screen readers, they are more, perceiving the information from these edge tags, native elements that you use. And if you're kind of using a paragraph and just giving it a visual appearance, it doesn't really make sense, because for them it is not at all perceivable. Have the light mode and the dark mode, which is a very good idea actually. I mean, there are often times where I don't really like being to work on the dark mode. For example, when I use Visual Studio Code, I prefer light mode. So all of us have a different preference. So always better to have these modes. Also, talking about skip links, you must have read about it. So, when the keyboard only users interact with your website, they use a tab key to navigate between the links, which means, they would not, as a visual user, they would not use the mouse. They will use the keyboard navigation. And if you have too many links on your header or a menu, they must have to tap through all the links, because they are the keyboard only users, and it might get annoying sometimes for the keyboard only users to go through all the links and then go to the main content. So providing a skip link basically gives you that way that you allow the user to directly go to the main content and bypass all other things very easily. So this is how you would do it. For example, I have like a skip link here as a component. I see, okay, these are my links and what are the lengths. And I basically map through, and each of the link item is just like a, which is like, a link to something. So now this is like a component, but how would this component work? You would always keep it, off screen, because this will only be seen to the keyboard users while they are tabbing. So the first thing when you tab, and the screen readers will come through is this thing. So when you land on a website, you say tab, this is the first thing that should be, tabbed through and should be navigable. So I'll show you a very quick example at Vanguard. So if you see on the left corner, there is a way, if you press tab, you directly reach to, this part of the content, which means now okay, this is the main content on this page. So while screen readers are, reading your page, you already know, okay, this is the main content. Always have like a descriptive name for your alt text, which is another WCAG success criteria, and it falls under level A. So that I have a beautiful image here, like 2 men with a flag. Yeah, I mean, I could give a description, alt tag saying 2 men holding a flag, but it makes more sense to make it more descriptive, because when the screen readers are navigating, for them visually nothing is at all visible. So providing them more information is only the way you could serve them more accurately. Having more unique having a unique titles on all your pages. So I mean, we already have React Helmet in React, so definitely use it. And unique titles are the way that screen readers at least have the context of what page they are on while they are navigating from one page to another. So always provide it. Start using fragments instead of div. I mean, just using a div, I mean, we all started with this, like, previous versions, since you cannot return two adjacent children from your render method. And that's how we used to, wrap it around div. But that's not a good idea. Wrap it with fragment, because fragment is not like another element in your DOM. It just wraps things. But when you say, when you wrap things with div, it is like one more element. And if it doesn't make sense to have that extra element in your DOM, it might confuse screen reader users. Again, I say handling forms. How would in forms, there are three main aspects to be really looking, you should look into. For example, required fields, errors, and we'll go through all of them. Sorry. So first, let's go through input component. And let's say, you're filling up this form, you tried logging in, and it says, okay, you forgot your username. This thing is natively handled. There's no rocket science to it. How would I build my input component? Let's quickly check that. So this is like an input component. I'm passing all of the things that is required by an input component. For example, ID, type, label, placeholder, and I say required equal to true. Now, how would my input component look like? So my input component would look something like this, which means, in the render method, you see, what you're rendering is your label and your input component. So input and label are always tied together. Make sure, yes, even if your label is sort of blank, it's fine. You can just keep it blank, but always tie it with your label and input component. And now here, what you see I've done in this component is I'm checking that if I've passed a required as a prop. If yes, just add an input props required to it, and then I'm just trying to spread it here in my component, which means my component is already taking care of required fields if I pass required as a prop in my input component. One thing to note is there might be a case where you still might not have an HTML5 support. So it's a good way to always include area required explicitly, because when you pass required here and you kind of spread here the required attribute, yes, for sure, it is also taking care for screen readers. But if there's no HTML5 support, you need to explicitly specify area required. Only then the screen readers would know that that field is a required field. Also, dealing with multiple required fields. When you're dealing with multiple required fields, make sure that you kind of provide some things at the top stating that, okay, these are the required fields. This really helps the screen reader users. Provide more instructions wherever necessary, because it's all about text when they are navigating through screen readers, right? More information you provide, the more they perceive. So when you have a required field with a specific format, for example, let's take a date field. And now, how would my input component look like? I would say, okay, input required true, label is date, type is date, and this is the value. Good. How would I give more information about, something is, this is the format and this is how it should be? How would you do that? You would do that by area labeled by, which means in the input, you're passing this area attribute, and you say area labeled by instruct, which means instruct here is your ID, which is like a span. So it can take multiple IDs. You can pass multiple IDs to area labeled by, and that's how it works. So now when the screen reader will go through this input field, they will read date must be TTMMYY format. So it gives them already a clue of what this format should look like. You can pass, as I said, it accepts multiple IDs already, so you could just go on and provide the necessary information. Good. So what is area labeled by intended to do? It is intended to identify the element that labels the current element, right? And what we did here is we did not override or overrided the label, but basically provided more information about the label. So in this case, doing it via area described by would be more appropriate, rather than doing it with area labeled by. Area described by works in the same way. You basically give it an ID, and then when the screen reader will go through your input field, it would read that date must be MMDDYY format or whatever format it is. You provide it, and this is how the screen readers gets that information. So here doing it via area described by is more appropriate than doing it via area labeled by. And what is the basic difference between them? As you saw, area labeled by specifies and overrides the label. When you want to do that, use area labeled by, but when you want to provide more information about the current element, give area described by. Use area described by. How would you handle errors? So area described by actually works with it very well. You could see that have your input component always, tied to your error, because while submitting a form, for example, you should know that error belongs to which field. Here, two important things to note. I've used area described by and then given it an ID, which is email errors. So which means anything that will be now happening as an error will be associated to this field. And I'll also show you how the error component looks like. I've also passed an area invalid because you should know that what is happening. Until there is an error, this field will be invalid, right? So you should also provide an area invalid to your component. Now let's see how the error component looks like. We have a div with role alert, which is a good thing to note because role alert kind of gives them a sense to the screen reader users that, okay, there is something that needs attention, which means there's an error and I need to fix it, and only then I can move ahead filling up the form. So definitely good idea. Not good idea. You should have a role alert if you're using div, for example. And that's how the errors will be rendered. Now, as I said before, area invalid should be used in conjunctions with associating the error message field, which means they should be used with area described by. Let's see how we should handle disabled buttons. Do not disable it using a disable attribute. Why? I will tell you before. Let me tell you after this slide because it makes more sense. So let's say you have an action component wherein if you pass a disabled prop to it, you render something like this in your JSX. So you say, okay, if this prop is there, something like this should happen. So a button type submit with disabled attribute. If you do this thing, what happens is disabled button is actually removed from your accessibility tree, which means now if the screen reader is navigating through your page, they don't really have an idea about this disabled button at all, which is not a good idea. So what you should do instead, have a button in your render method. What should happen actually is have a button, have a class, have everything. Instead of disabled, provide area disabled so that the screen readers know that this button is disabled, and provide a CSS, which will be a class definitely to your element. Provide some of the CSS which should make it look like disabled, which means you'll provide a CSS wherein you can't really click it via mouse. For example, cursor not allowed, opacity, you will decrease the opacity. You will also say pointer events none, which means from the mouse, you can't really now tab through this button, which is a good thing, good. But what about the keyboard users? So you should also make sure that you're kind of preventing the click event to happen. So all's good now. So you kind of did it without making and using the disabled attribute, which is a good thing, because otherwise you would not ever make sure that your screen readers know about this button. And now, are we done? No. So as soon as you are sure that now this button needs to be enabled, You can set the area disabled to false. Remove all the classes that you applied to the disabled class to make it look enabled now, and allow the submit button to trigger the submit, which you could do it via JavaScript. So that's it. I mean, that was very simple. Now, let's say, we always made sure that in our action component, we made sure that, okay, have the allowed disabled attribute. If you pass this as a prop, you would disable the button, but don't use it, I mean, until and unless you want to make sure that this button should also not be shown by, or even accessed by the screen readers. Only then use it. But I don't think there is any use case. And now, how do you deal with focus indicators, right? They're the best part actually of accessibility. Let's say, I've just written a button and a link. There's a button and a link, and it's a default native HTML. How would the focus indicators look like? In default in various browsers, for example, on the right-hand side, you see it's Firefox. On the left-hand side, you see it's Chrome. The behavior varies. So the default focus indicators behavior varies, and none of the designers will really like it. And they'll come to you, they'll say, okay, this is how it should look like. And you'll be like, okay, let's do it. And you'll be like, removing the outline would help, and some box shadow. But do not remove them unless you've alternative. And even if you have an alternative, make sure that the outline that you give is not none, but instead 3px or whatever you want to keep it, make it transparent, but do not remove it. Because sometimes when you use box shadow in the dark contrast mode, box shadow doesn't really work well. So in that case, you need to make sure that you're not removing the outline altogether. Instead, making sure that you provide it a transparent with a solid and 3px. So good, handled focus. Good. Now the next thing is, how would you programmatically manage focus? Since you're working with React, which is a single page app, which means you might have to go from one route to another. Even if it's a single page app, you definitely have to go, which means your link component or the route that you're using need to be aware of where the keyboard focus should be once you land on that page, right? And this is really important because, once you move from one page to another, it's really important that you have the keyboard focus placed on the main section of that page, because it really will be helpful for the screen reader users. How would you do that? Quickly in the component wherever on the page you are, on that page, you'll make sure that, the focus is on that page. And this could happen just writing in your use effect. So always make sure that on any page, you sort of provide a focus by default when you load that page to main section of your page. This could be heading, this could be some main section that you're trying to show on that page. So very important. So take charge of your focus. If you really want to test your website, if it's keyboard navigable or not, just open it, start pressing tab, and you should be able to move forward to all the interactive elements that are on your page. And basically, shift plus tab should move you backwards, and you should be able to navigable everywhere on all of the interactive elements. Saying something about handling dialogues, there's already a sort of lot of models already in the React community that are accessible. One of them is area model, React area model. One is Reach UI dialog model, which we use at Vanguard. One is React LI dialog. So yeah, sort of just use them because they're already there. Now, something about DOM and visual order. All of us love Flexbox. It makes things easier for us as a developer. But be careful when doing it, as it desynchronizes the DOM from the visual order, which might sometimes be confusing for your keyboard only users, because you might just ruin the DOM and the visual order. So be careful, even when you're using it, just be careful. Also, something related to performance, right? All of us love performance, and something you would want to improve on the website as a performance is really a good thing. So there's a new thing which recently came, and there's this content visibility auto, and this enables the user agent to skip an element's rendering work, which means the layout and the painting would be skipped off until it is needed, which means a large portion of your content is off screen, leveraging the content visibility property. So this will help you that your page load is much faster. Yes, it is a good idea, but sometimes on the sections of content, you might include headings or any section that shouldn't be in this content visibility auto. And that is why I recommend keeping the headings and the landmarks elements outside of the regions styled with content visibility auto. So this is one of the articles by Marcy Sutton. You should really read it. Hiding content, don't do it. Just don't do it. Instead, what you should do is have some sort of CSS which might throw your element off the screen and still be accessible to the screen readers. Self-explanatory CTAs. Make sure, wherever possible, the visual layer doesn't need to be that self-explanatory. So here, if you see a views and action button, but the visual hidden button is only, visually hidden, but it is making sure that screen readers could access this. So this is an icon component, and I've passed an icon to it and a label here. And you could see how I've made sure that icon component is rendered. So if you have a label, you basically return that SVG, because this is an icon with the focusable false and area hidden. But if you have a label, what you do is you also write a span with it and with the visual hidden and a prop to it. So this means that this label would be visually hidden, which will only be accessed by the screen readers. So yes, creating accessible animations, this is one of the good things, because I'm a big fan of animations, but when used properly, I believe they add a ton of value to the user experience. That said, you should be mindful of the fact that not everybody experiences the same. Some folks might trigger physical symptoms like nausea, dizziness, and you would not want to give that symptom to anyone. So already in the OS, there is a check mark that you could tick, and all your animations would be stopped. There's a media query that you could use. For example, preferred reduced motion. In this section, you saw that how we are kind of handling this. So definitely use it. Maybe have a toggle in your web app to set off all of the animations. There's a quick talk by Inclusive Motion talk by Wellhat. You should really watch this. Some quick development and testing tools, some linting tools we'll discuss. There's JSX LI, which you could use, which statically checks the accessibility mistakes while you're writing your code. There's ReactX, which you could use, which pops out all the errors on the console that you should go back and fix. There's Spelly, which is also an automated accessibility testing pal, which is like an internal audit. You could use it on your command line. Some sanity checks you should do have light mode, dark mode, check if button, label, content is descriptive, have a mechanism to pause the background video, have contrast color always sufficient. Make sure you're compliant with WCAG 2.1, because this is like a sort of standard thing now across all of the companies that they're trying to reach. So make sure you're compliant. So we at Vanguard support all of the ways that we could test it manually. For example, using JAWS, VoiceOver, keyboard. We also support for low vision. So definitely do that. There's something in Chrome which recently came up. You can actually simulate the vision and see, how your website looks like. So, which is a good thing. Make use of the dev tools. Get skilled, test, and build accessible apps. Last thing, I also wrote a book. So if you really want to have an immense knowledge of whatever I said, or more about accessibility, go and buy. Definitely. And yes, subscribe to my newsletters if you want to, if you like to read about accessibility or React. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manjula. Very informative and excellent presentation. Can I share the slides with the community now?
Yeah.
Okay, because I think they are very, very precious to learn.
I think I had to skip some of the slides.
Yeah, I understand. Only 22 minutes, actually, we crossed that barrier a lot. So there will be only one question, which I promised to ask. What if we are getting images from some external API, which is not delivering any alt text to it? Have you ever tried how to handle this kind of issue?
Yeah, I mean, even if you're receiving the images from external API, it would still be a link, right? It would still be a link to the image. You would still render it on your side using image tag source equal to the link, right? So there is a possibility to provide an alt text.
Yeah, well, I understood that Jeju thinks that there is one link with multiple links, let's say, concerning mountains, and there's one mountain and another mountain coming from the same link. So still, we don't know. Maybe there is an artificial intelligence tool which will describe what's actually on the picture. But yeah, if they don't give you the alt, I think there is no way how you can show or fill in this attribute.
If they don't give you the alt link, tell them to give it.
Yeah, tell them, because we are developers, we also have power, and we can use these tools which provide better accessibility.
I would be happy if somebody has any questions regarding the talk or regarding accessibility in general. Please reach out to me later as well on Twitter. I'm very active. I'll answer you, I promise.